Good morning, everybody. It's Miss Hopkins here. My kids woke up with pink eye. They're sick, and so I have to take them to the doctor and not be at school today, which makes me sad because I love to be at school with you guys. It's like my favorite place in the world. So uh, instead, we are going to do this day digitally. Yay! Okay, so. We've been talking about the Middle Ages, and we're going to come up on the Crusades here. And actually today, we're not really going to go into the Crusades themselves. We're going to talk about what Europe was like right before the Crusades, and kind of give you a little backstory here. All right, so first let's talk about the rulers of England. England doesn't exist yet, right? Like, there's not a England, there's just a bunch of villages and kingdoms where the Angles and the Saxons live, right? So, in the 400s CE, after the fall of Rome, the Angles and the Saxons live there in that place that's modern day England and the Celtic region, which would be Ireland and Scotland and kind of the northern Europe region. Um, Vikings attack them in the late 800s because that's what Vikings did. And a guy named King Alfred of Wessex. Wessex would be one of the kingdoms, one of the Angles or Saxon kingdom. He drives away the Vikings. And because he does this, then he becomes the king of all of the kingdoms over the United Kingdoms. So we call that the United Kingdom there, and we still call it the United Kingdom. And because he was an Angle, they call this new kingdom Angleland, which eventually gets shortened down into England. And so that's where the name England comes from. It comes from the word Angleland. He rules from 871 to 899 CE. So he is the first king of England, basically. King Alfred of Wessex is the first king of England. One of the things he did is he rewrote the Latin books in Anglo-Saxon language, which eventually is going to become English. It's like Old English. You probably would have a hard time reading it if you went back and you read these books. It wouldn't be like reading a modern day book. It's very Old English, but it's the start of the English language there, Anglo-Saxon language. But after him, there's weak rulers in England, and they're not able to keep up the same level of control over that area. So there's a guy named William the Conqueror. William the Conqueror is not actually in Angleland. He is in a part of western France that the Vikings had conquered. William the Conqueror was a descendant of the Vikings. The Vikings had conquered this area of western France, and they called it Normandy after Norsemen. They called themselves Norsemen, right? Men of the North. So they call this area Normandy, and they're the Normans is what they're referred to as. So, excuse me, in the mid 1000s of CE of this common era, William becomes the ruler of Normandy. His cousin is actually King Edward of England. So King Edward also a descendant of the Vikings. So King Edward's in England. William is in Normandy, and Edward dies, and a guy named Howard Godwinson takes over England. Well, William didn't like that. William figured that it was his right as a kinsman of Edward that he should be the one who takes over England, and so he decides to fight for it. And in 1066, he defeats England in something called the Battle of Hastings. Pretty bloody, because battles were back then. You didn't have drones, you didn't have tanks. You walked up on people and stabbed them and punched them in the face. So in 1066, he defeats England in the Battle of Hastings, and he becomes the ruler of England. Look at that, it's over my face. Ah, so sad. So William the Conqueror becomes the ruler of England. And because of that, because he's still the ruler of Normandy, and he's the ruler of the Anglo-Saxons, the cultures begin to merge. They start to marry each other. The Normans, he gives land to his Norman army so that they will stay loyal to him. And so the Normans move to England or England at this point, and they start to bring their culture with them. And there were things that the Anglo-Saxons liked, and so they adopted it. And there were things about the Anglo-Saxons that the Normans liked, and they adapted that. So that's where we see the merging of cultures is here after William the Conqueror. Okay, so that's England. Now let's talk about France and Russia. Um, France is pretty boring. I mean, they get land taken away and they take it back. And there's a lot of Philips. Okay, so Philip II, he rules from 1180 to 1223 CE, and he's the one who actually takes Western France or that region of Normandy back away from England. Um, William the Conqueror joined it then in like 1050, and in the late 1000s, and 100 years later, Philip II takes it back and makes it part of France. Philip IV, or as he's known as Philip the Fair, he rules from 1285 to 1314 CE, and he begins the Parliament in France. We see the beginning of the French government take place, really the one that, I mean, basically how it's going to stay in France until the French Revolution is how we see the beginning of that here in the late 1200s. Okay, in the 500s, the Slavs populate Eastern Europe. Now, when we talk about the Slavs, what we are talking about are the Croats, the Serbs, the Bulgarians, the Poles, the Czechs, the Slovaks, the Ukrainians, the Belarusians, and the Russians. So we're talking about that Eastern European section of the world that still exists. Excuse me. The Vikings were the ones who ruled over these Slavic countries. There is a Viking king in 900 CE named Oleg. And Oleg, he starts building the city of Kiev, which still exists. And then the state around Kiev is called the Kiev Rus, or I'm sorry, the Kievan Rus. The Kievan Rus. It's he's uniting these peoples around where he's at. So like the Croats and the Serbs and the Bulgarians and Poles, he's uniting all of them into kind of a nation there, and that's called the Kievan Rus. The leader of the Kievan Rus was not referred to as a king; he was called the Grand Duke, and the nobles were called boyars, and they're still going to be called boyars for a lot of years. For like hundreds of years after that, Russian nobles are called boyars. But the name of Grand Duke is going to change. Okay, so the kingdom of the Kievan Rus gets merged by marriage with the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire is, of course, the Eastern Roman Empire turns into the Byzantine Empire. So it gets merged with the Kievan Rus. He declares that the Slavs are Eastern Orthodox, which the Byzantine people are Eastern Orthodox. We talked about the difference between Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic. There's a lot of similarities, but there are some differences. And he decides that his people they are Eastern Orthodox. They're not Catholic, they're not Muslim, they're Eastern Orthodox. Which would end a change from the Viking culture, which was pagan. Okay, so around 1240 CE, Mongols from Asia come and take over the Kievan Rus. Okay, they are coming up through Asia into Russia is where they're going to hit first before they start to try to take over the rest of Europe. So the Russians, they were allowed to keep the Kievan Rus intact, but they had to pay tribute to the Mongol Khan. Khan is a ruler. So the Mongol Khan from Mongolia, the king from Mongolia would be the Mongol Khan. Okay, so they have to pay tribute to the Mongol Khan. And the city of Moscow begins to grow at this time. Kiev is the big city up to this point. Moscow starts to take over a little bit. And it becomes the center of the Russian Eastern Orthodoxy. It becomes the religious center, like Constantinople is the religious center in the Byzantine Empire, and Rome is the religious center in the Roman Empire. Well, Moscow is the religious center in Russian Eastern Orthodox churches. There's a ruler named Ivan III, and he comes into power 1462, and he's referred to as Ivan the Great. And Ivan the Great is the first one to call himself a czar. It's a shortened version of the name Caesar, which is the rulers of Rome were called themselves Caesar. Well, he calls himself czar. He builds palaces and cathedrals. He's trying to take the Kievan Rus up into this really elaborate empire. He acts like an emperor. He wants big elaborate buildings built. He wants people to know that his place is awesome. Okay, so he builds palaces and cathedrals. And he's able to end the Mongol rule in 1480 CE. And instead of being controlled by the Mongols, the Russians at this point, they're not Vikings anymore, they're Russians. They are able to take back their land. Okay, this is how the Crusades start. We have this back history of what Europe looks like at this time. Well, in 1071, so this is, 400 years before the Russians take back their land. And, this is right in it's a tumultuous time. People are, like, in Russia and in France and in England, it's a time of change for all of those places. So in 1071, Muslim Turks seize control of the Byzantine lands in Asia. Excuse me. And this is the beginning of before they start to take over that land in Kievan Rus. They're going to seize these lands that are actually in Asia. Okay, I'm going to make you breakfast in a second. I'm still doing this lesson. This is my middle kid, guys. This is CJ. CJ, say hi to all the students. Hi. Okay, I'll make you breakfast in just a second, okay? Got it. Okay, so the Muslim Turks, they seize control of the Byzantine lands in Asia. And so the Byzantine rulers decide that they're not just going to stand by and let that happen. It was rough because they knew that they didn't have nearly as much power or control as the Muslim Turks did, and that they wouldn't be able to defeat them on their own. So what they do is they ask for the church's help. Okay, this is something new. This is not, the church was involved in politics and government, but they didn't have control over wars. And so the Byzantine rulers ask for the church's help in defending the Christian empire. They decided that it was Muslims against Christians. The Byzantine rulers decided it was Muslims against Christians. And so in a new move, a surprise move in 1095 CE, so 20 years later, Pope Urban II asked for Europe's Lord to launch a holy war against the Muslim Turks. Okay, he gives this big grand speech. Here is part of the speech. Jerusalem is the navel of the world. This is the land that the Redeemer of mankind illuminated by his coming. This royal city, situated in the middle of the world, is now held captive by his enemies. It looks for hope and freedom. It begs unceasingly for you to come to its aid. Okay, we are going to examine that in a future assignment and break it down a little bit. But this was the beginning of what we are going to see as the first big holy war that launches the Crusades. And we're going to go back more into that later this week. All right, guys, I miss you.